Monetizing podcasts is hard work, very hard. But we're here to help. We have a panel for you at Podcast Movement in Denver coming up August 24th, noon Denver time. It is called Podcasting SuperPower Brand Integration. And we have with us today here at the studios of HOK Productions in downtown LA, House of Knaus. Thank you, Dustin Knaus, for opening your doors to us. We have Mike Jensen with us today.
Well, thank you, Dave. I'm excited. I think we're all excited for the location in Denver.
Yes.
So I think we're a little pep in our step coming out of HOK Productions here. And look, from a standpoint of this panel, hey, I'm passionate about the intersection of content and brand integration and sponsorship and being authentic about making sure that we've got an active listener that's hearing our ads.
You always have been passionate about that. And so when we were putting this panel together, you were the first person that I thought of. He's the guy that comes to the content meetings and says, how are we going to sell this to advertisers and help these advertisers grow their businesses by integrating them into our content? You've always been all about that. So this panel is perfect for you.
I think one of the things that has been really exciting about the space for so many years is that it's been a very collaborative space. And so I think there's been a great sort of integration of content folks and sponsorship and salespeople. Certainly, I'm a salesperson at heart, but I think what we've built in a community that's growing and much bigger, right? It's $1 billion industry now, but I think some of that DNA continues where, both on the sponsorship side and the content side, it's like, hey, let's look at this show. What's the listen through rate? What's the viewership rate? Where should we be putting, these ad placements? How authentic do they sound? I mean, there's no question in my mind that, and I'll date myself a little bit, but 20 plus years in media, the most powerful sponsorship for return on investment that I've ever sold is a podcast ad. More powerful than anything else I've ever sold for actually convincing people to research and buy products and services.
Well, speaking of research, it certainly backs that up. That whether it sounds profitable or Signal Hill Insights, Edison Research, Coleman Research now doing some interesting things as well. The research shows that unlike other forms of advertising where people will not admit that advertising persuades them, with podcasting, people say, yeah, I like to support the people who support the podcasts that I listen to. And that's very unique. This weekend, as we're recording this, is the opening weekend for the Barbie movie at Warner Brothers. And you know that the folks at Warner have thought for years before this launch this weekend about all of the ways they're going to use that IP. From merchandise, well, obvious merchandise, the merchandise existed first, to theme parks, to drive-through fast food specials, cups and what have you. It's all happening now. And I'm starting to see in our nascent business of podcasting, not only the standalone branded podcasts that we do at Sound That Brands, but also far beyond that, ways that brands are integrated, and we're thinking about going beyond CPM. If I were a salesperson in podcasting, I'd be so bored with selling a commodity, a CPM-based commodity. I might as well be selling, I don't know, grain futures or something, hearkening back to my Midwestern background. Why get caught up in the numbers game? You have to sometimes, of course. It's a big part of the business. But what can separate is doing what Mike does, the brand integration.
Yeah, and I think brand integration is sort of different and executed in different ways for different types of shows, right? So, when we talk about different solutions for sponsorship, we have a show at Rhapsody Voices, Jim Cornette, a leading sort of culture meets sports and wrestling show that does nearly 500,000 listeners a week, but that show's a long form show. Those listeners are in it for a long form session. And so the capability in that show is to have a longer read and sponsorship. And the hosts are passionate about the authenticity of those reads and the fact that they can do a longer read in that particular format show. And they archive, unbelievably, every sponsorship they ever do. They take pride in it. And that's great. That's a great fit for that show. And it works really, really well. But it's not necessarily always a great fit for a longer form read in the case of maybe a business show, where maybe that show's only 20 minutes. And while you might have a very authentic read, that's what you want to have, whether it be dynamic or baked in, the audience, you have to respect kind of what they're there for. In a 20-minute show, sometimes you'll have to look at those reads and say, you know what, this really should be a 90-second read, right? This should be something that should be shorter and to the point for this particular show. Mm-hmm. And I think looking at the show and what's the makeup and the DNA of the audience and how they're consuming it and recognizing, what needs to happen for each brand integration is really, really important.
Yeah. And that takes understanding the brands that you're working with,
Yep.
Really getting to know them and what drives their audience. I was not meaning to be negative, but I remember a few years ago, I mentioned that you're working with a somewhat, at the time, you don't anymore, controversial talent on your network. And I said, I see you're working with so-and-so. And I think you kind of took it as, yeah, what up? But what you said was, he sells a lot of sunglasses. And I love that. That's the bottom line. Not that this was a person that was that you should be ashamed to be associated with, but you probably did get some flack from people at times. But moving the product or lifting the brands, one or the other, it's usually what it comes down to, and it's the results that matter.
Yeah, and I think everybody that's joining Denver, we can all celebrate the fact that this is a business that is an evolution of talk on demand content, right? And so, the reality is that there are a lot of different audiences that are being served. So you may not love that show, but guess what? Those people that are listening and viewing that show, they love that show, and they've been given more choices for on-demand talk audio than ever before, and that's what's driving our business forward. So we just have to continue to think about, okay, what are the best ways for brand integration around that? And to that end, I said listening/viewing, we know that viewership is now a big deal,
right?
In podcasting, and we're having to sort of, remind ourselves to say show. And I celebrate that. We've had multi-channel shows where we've started to look at brand integration and say, okay, love the show in the video format, but we're also taking segments of that show, longer segments of that show, 3 or 4 minutes. And in those cases, looking at this show and how it's distributed on YouTube differently than the traditional RSS
Absolutely.
feed, and putting brand sponsors in those segments and in the long form show, because that audience is different in the way they're consuming the show.
Absolutely.
And they can't necessarily take it to the grocery store, but they are loving the viewership and the ability to view the show. And so it's changing brand integration in that way. We have to look at each show and say, well, where's this audience going in video? Where are they going in audio? And how should we customize it so that we're maximizing the opportunity for the sponsor? And I think that's something that we're going to see more and more of. And we haven't even started talking about social yet and how we could be promoting shows on social. And maybe there's brand integrations on that sponsorship. I know we've done some of that. I think there's a lot more that can be done there.
So give us some case study example. I'm going to put you on the spot. Case study examples of some cool things that you've been able to do with brand integration.
Well, I think about a show that, I guess I'm going to plug a competitor, but John Campia, who's over at AdvertiseCast, does a wonderful TV and film show. And executive producer Scott Porch on that show does a great job as well on that show. But you know what? It's 4 times a week. And I look at that show and look at working with that team. And the reality is, it's great to have sponsors in each one of those segments throughout the week and selling John Campia as what it is, which is a sponsorship of the full week of that show.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not buying the cherry on top of the sundae. And the reality is for sponsors, it is better served to sell that show by the week. Yeah. Right. So there's an example of, okay, what does this show call for? Right. Mm-hmm. And how should we do it better? Whereas I think that there are some wonderful shows that are once a week, and maybe you want to look at more of an integrated sponsorship, right? We've done things where it's hey, I think you should own the lion's share of, the content in this show, right? Where you own the 100% share of voice in a particular show, of this show for the week. I think there are different examples for different shows.
I don't know the last time that I sat down at 9:30, I guess it is now, on a Saturday night, West Coast, to watch Saturday Night Live actually live.
Right.
But I know everything that's on Saturday Night Live. We've got to be in all of these channels. I feel like I'm a Saturday Night Live viewer, even though I don't sit down and watch NBC on Saturday nights. And so what you see them doing and what you've been doing with so many of your shows, and where companies like HOK Productions, where we're at, come into play. All this multi-channel, if we think of it as, I know this isn't original at all, and bear with me for not talking down to you here at all, audience, but the content, the hub and spoke thing of creating great content, and then figuring out all the different directions we can take that content and rework it and make it accessible and have it fit the audiences to each of those different spokes.
Yeah, and sometimes, those spokes allow for timely execution. So for example, I think about the really long-term successful DraftKings campaign we've done with personalities like Brendan Schaub and Theo Von. That campaign, we would do promos for DraftKings with content around the shows and picking winners for the upcoming fights and pushing that out on those personalities' socials, in addition on the podcast, because the fight's coming up this week, right? So the difference is, not only just being a sponsor in the podcast, Brendan and Theo and other leading personalities around that campaign are promoting it on their social, promoting the show at the same time, and driving people's interest in engaging with DraftKings ahead of it. And so the difference is, of course, not necessarily hitting people as they consume the podcast, but it is about the podcast, talking about the podcast on the Instagram video feed that's promoting DraftKings ahead of that fight, right?
Right.
So getting millions of viewers and listeners that are community-based around the podcast, but
Sure.
through social, right? And then needing that to be executed because that fight's coming up in 5 days. And Brendan, Theo, they're all picking their winner ahead of time. That's great content.
Sure.
It's great for DraftKings, and it's timely.
Yeah. Thursday, August 24th, Denver, local time, noon. Do not go to the airport. Do not pass go. Do not go grab lunch and say, oh, too many panels, I'm done. Come to this one to see Mike Jensen, see Angie Moore from Wondery, and it's called Podcasting Superpower Brand Integration. We should have called it FCPM. That's what I'm thinking. Is it too late? Can we change it?
It feels late.
Okay.
Late, but I'm excited to spend time with you both, even if you're, feel like you're late on the rebranding. And I think it's going to be such a great time to reconnect with everybody at Podcast Movement, and appreciative of the folks at Podcast Movement that put such a great event together every year that brings us together, because we're all living in, a hybrid at a minimum. Work environment. It's going to be great to see everybody there face to face.
Yeah, we need this. Every industry needs these events where we can come together and have that FaceTime. And thank you, Podcast Movement. Denver can be hot in August, but it ain't Orlando. It's not Dallas. We thank you for that as well.
And thank you to Dustin and HOK Productions, because, they are a preferred production partner of my company, Rhapsody Voices, and they do a great job of all things production and post-production. And how long were we here today? 2 hours? We took up a little bit more time than maybe we said we would.
Yeah, I know. They're very nice. When they have good talent to work with, you'd be amazed what they can do. Thank you.
Thank you.